this wonderful, lovely panel here. Mostly known for science fiction, and for this person on my chest, that my wife refers to as the other woman in my life. The Carr Chronicles are 10 books set in Confederation space, and if you're curious, I'll tell you more about them. But let's hear from the panel, and we'll start over here with Elizabeth. Just a brief, because we'll sum up at the end with where they can get your books and where you're going to be, but just a little thing of why you think you're here for science.
That's a really good question. I'm trying to figure that out myself.
Possibly a punishment.
I'm Elizabeth Lord. Work at the Ryan Research Center, which is one of the older parapsychologist centers in the United States. And I edit for the Journal of Parapsychology, and also for the organization called New Thinking Aloud, which is another parapsychology organization. I've got one book out. It's a YA novel about a telepathic teenager, and she works with an organization called the Science Syndicate, and together they try to save a 12-year-old girl who's been abducted.
And now?
Mel Todd, I write urban fantasy, and I'm pretty sure I'm here because John wanted to punish me.
Testing your endurance.
Yes, that one.
Ari?
Yep. Hi, I am the one, the only, the R.E. Carr, and I am here because I learned this week I am actually an award-winning author of 6 science fantasy novels. So I guess that's why I'm on the panel.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm Garrett Overeem. I write the sci-fi fantasy series Second Life of Mr. Hunt. Can a man accidentally brought back from the dead save the future? I wrote by accident because I only wanted to write one book, so I threw everything I liked in it, and ended up like writing, so ended up in sci-fi fantasy.
This was a short story that got out of control.
I had a 6-book trilogy, so I understand.
Science fantasy is an ill-defined genre, but it seems to credit itself to descending from the line of work of Edgar Rice Burroughs, probably chiefly identified with John Carr of Mars. We'll go a little into the elements of that as this group sees it, but that's kind of where it seems to be. But it is an ill-defined group of stories, and it seems to embrace everything from Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carr of Mars, to Star Wars.
Yes.
Okay. Let's start over here, Elizabeth. Give me your sort of broad thoughts on the genre of science fantasy.
It's not a genre that I'm terribly familiar with. This is part of why I'm mystified. But you could argue this is science fantasy if you don't think parapsychology is a science. And if you think parapsychology is bunk, then it could be considered science fantasy. So I think it's the eye of the beholder sometimes. I think some people will look at Star Wars and say, definitely science fiction, except they don't use any science fact in it. You know, they really don't go into any plausible method for the ships to fly. They utilize incorrect terminology. A lot of it's about the Force. Most of it's about the Force, which is, you know, a spiritual thing, which you could argue is a fantasy thing. So I guess the fantasy aspect, and what I was reading about it, is that science is the plausible part of it, and fantasy is the implausible. So that's what I understand it to be.
Good start. Now, we'll figure it out.
Basically, you either have hard sci-fi or you have science fantasy. If you're reading Hal Clemens, it's hard sci-fi. He's going to give you all the math. He's going to justify every single thing he's done. Everything else is going to follow Arthur C. Clarke's axiom that any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's where us as writers, we go, like, I love Star Trek. Star Trek is science fantasy. It is, because we can't figure out a way to travel faster than light right now, which means it's called hand-wavium. We say, there is science that explains this.
And there's Q, let's be real. There's
Q.
gods.
There's gods.
Yeah.
So pretty much most of what you read tends to be science fantasy, though I sometimes think maybe we should actually call it science hope, because we hope that we can figure out how to do this stuff. Because the idea of traveling faster than light, to be able to get outside of our solar system in the person's lifetime, it's still fantasy because we don't know how to do it. But that's also what makes it speculative fiction, is we apply the hand-wavium that somehow we're going to do this, and that might let us see all the other things that are out there.
We can draw some comfort from the fact that our physical scientists 20 years ago didn't know that 96% of the universe was missing dark matter. So there is some hope that there are physics left to be explored that can do this. And I think that's where sort of in between the magic and the hope, as you say, is that there's something that we just don't know yet.
Well, I mean,
But it's possible.
they've been coming up with a lot of stuff. How many of you guys have followed string entanglement theory? So you start getting into this. So entanglement theory is literally the idea that you have this quantum quark right here, and you have this other one 5,000 light years away, and they can connect. And there's the possibility that you might be able to actually create an engine that for this little tiny quark that's here on Earth, and this little tiny quark that's somewhere in Alpha Centauri, and you can go whip.
And then, of course, you can write a book where you use that as the justification for summoning a demon vampirito. I actually used entanglement theory for that because I always sneak a little bit of science into my fantasy. The particular part where I do is there is another version of science fantasy where Doctor Who is a very good example of science fantasy, where you take something that is traditionally magical. In my case, it's vampires. But instead of there being a magic and just that pure, like, there's a reason for this that's mystical, in my case, vampires happen to be colonial parasitic organisms that descended from siphonophores that are obligate carnivores. They take over the dying bodies of human shells and use them. And they happen to, because of this interaction, become severely photoallergic. They also react to things like cellulose. So if you stuck a piece of wood into their center mass, they react to it and die from an allergic reaction.
Anaphylactic shock.
Anaphylactic shock, basically. So it's using science to explain something that's as ridiculous as a vampire, and that's a very real subset of science fantasy, which is almost just like there's high fantasy and low fantasy, there's kind of that high science fantasy, which is your Star Wars and your Star Trek, and then there's stuff like this where you're basically using science to wave away the fantastical, which Doctor Who does kind of fit in, and then there's time travel, and that just brings up a whole new ball of wax.
Sure.
For me, science fantasy is taking science fiction, which is theoretical science, and then throwing on top of it mystical and magical elements. That's the way I see it. Like H.G. Wells with the time machine. You know, he had a theoretical time machine, and then he went to fantastical worlds of time between that. You know, some things aren't possible now. You know, communicators in Star Trek, now we have cell phones.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why, to me, it's science,
You have
theoretical
my
science.
tricorder over here.
Yeah.
And it's definitely a genre that has nuance and a spectrum and lots of ways of interpreting it, because it's not a hard, fast, it's not quite like a contemporary romance where you know these are the rules and this is what fits in it and it's exactly this. It's more of that catch-all for the stuff that's like, is it fantasy or is it sci-fi? Because those genres actually did kind of, they merge and they split. And this is sort of that fuzzy cloud where a lot of actually what we like resides.
You know, and I pull in a lot of Dungeons and Dragons into my sci-fi. So I was a big Dungeons and Dragons person from first edition. So I've been playing all those years, and I pull in little elements of that. And even some of the words you might find, I don't know, say a module name hidden somewhere in my books, if you're paying attention.
We were discussing this a little in the hallway, and it seems to me that, and I'll let the panel comment on this, one of the elements of science fiction fantasy, as you say, you could literally make Star Trek or any other science fiction show that is FTL fantasy. But I think if you do your science fiction such that you're taking that one given with it, it falls more to the science fiction, and though Hal Clement would probably throw a rock at me. But it seems that in the science fantasy setting, one of the things that is part of it is that the individual's prowess, usually with a weapon, is such that he can make a major difference. John Carter of Mars was stronger than any of the Martians. Luke Skywalker and the rest of them with the lightsabers and their ability to, deflect a bullet or a bolt coming out, which I, like that I am, do not like to try. So what are some of the elements that you would see as defining in science fantasy? You talked a little bit about the psychological...
The mystical nature
Yeah.
of the Force in Star Wars was one of the driving forces of the storyline.
So
You have to admit that.
non-causality.
So if your focus is on that implausible, and I think then you can lean in that direction. Whereas if you're, so I think the latest one I read was the Expanse series. Most of the focus of that was actually sociological. So I would call that science fiction, even though you're dealing with some unknown creatures that are eating people up and turning into these mycelial mats in space. And even that could have had a plausible explanation. So I would consider that series to be science fiction, not science fantasy.
Mel, do you feel that the individual's prowess is a part of it, that we're trying to still hang on to the knight in shining armor and
It's more the story. And so most of them, you talk about Star Wars, I was thinking Ice Pirates, you still tend to follow the hero's journey. You have somebody who has to have a layer of a redemption arc. You have the very basic elements that we usually talk about, either the hero's journey or the heroine's journey. It's the story. Whereas when you do the science fiction, let's take The Martian. You don't, that is a literal, what are the steps you have to do to survive? And because I know, Andy, we literally wrote the entire book to prove you could pull it off. There's no real character redemption or anything. It's literally this guy going, what do I have to do to stay alive? I think the breakdown comes when you're talking about actual story versus encapsulated serials. So, Battlestar Galactica, Star Trek, Farscape, Babylon 5, those don't have the overarching hero arcs like what we think of when we think of the big movies, the big stories, Foundation, that sort of stuff. Those are that. Those are where you have established a world where this happens because we say it do with magic sometimes or science, but the stories you're telling are the science and stuff, it's the props for the story, whereas stuff like Star Wars and stuff, the props are the story.
Would you agree with that, or take a different tack on it?
Well, it depends, because I was thinking about Babylon 5, which is it's an interesting example, because so much of it, they really do ground in these are the way people are now, this is the way societies are now. They do a lot to make the tech feel plausible, to jump gates feel sort of plausible, opening wormholes. But then they have magic, and they have basically Tolkien in space in it. So it does it's one of those ones that straddles, because I think the thing about science fantasy is it is not, I don't think it is one thing. It is it's the catch-all. And it's a good catch-all for what we have. And I think when you talk about science fantasy, there is always some element of the unknown. In pure science fiction, it's always about removing the unknown. It's about defining it and logically solving it and doing it. In science fantasy, in science fantasy, the unknown is okay, and that wonder is still kept as an intrinsic part of the story. So to me, that's the core
And in
principle.
science fiction, you want to analyze and know everything.
Correct. Science fiction is about clarity of story. Science fantasy is about wonder in story.
Sure.
Yeah, because I don't want to sit through a lecture or reading. I just want the ships fly, the lasers shoot.
I don't know, The Martian was a very entertaining lecture.
Well, yeah, Hal Clement did a lot of that. He mostly got away with it, but I think you're right that for a lot of people, it's just like when somebody starts singing in Tolkien, you go to the next part where someone starts talking.
Yeah, like that. Like I read the Tolkien books when I was little. Now I probably skip a lot of parts because I like adventure. I like fast adventure. I like to, to me, it can encompass many things. I like the hero's journey because as a kid I always wanted to be Luke Skywalker. I'm dressed as a stormtrooper now. And then I used to, always wanted to be the swashbuckling pirate, the knight in shining armor. So
that comes back a little bit to the point that I raised when I started this question down the road, which is it a big element of science fantasy that the individual has to have this outsized effect? Because, we've all seen the world wars, we've seen, combat, and God knows there's too much going on right now. The individual counts were very little in mass combats. The Russians washed the Germans out of their country with a tide of blood. Millions of people lost. So your individual prowess with a weapon was sort of irrelevant, but the hero's journey sort of requires him to be relevant.
Sort of, because you can take, go back to the 80s Flash. The Flash Gordon movie.
Yeah.
What type of hero was he? He had athletic prowess. He was a great
And he
quarterback.
had really great blonde hair that seemed to seduce everyone in Ming's court.
I met him. He was a very nice guy.
Yeah.
And he pulled my wife in very close for fun.
Well, it's another whole story. That could be and Flash Gordon, as you saw him all the way back through Buster Crabbe's incarnation of him, was a great swordsman. That was also one of the things about John Carter of Mars, that his ability to, have this prowess of personal combat made him relevant, and certainly to Deshathoris.
Buck Rogers was a great fighter pilot.
Yeah.
I think there tends to be, when you start talking about fantasy, again, going with the wonder, going with the excitement, there is that almost, Superman hero's journey. Superheroes are great science fantasy. If you look at the Marvel universe, it's all just different magic. I mean, literally now we have Doctor Strange, but, that is a very good example of science fantasy, because you have Iron Man on one end and you have Doctor Strange on the other. And then you have Doctor Doom when he eventually comes out, who's both. And
You have Loki in the middle.
Loki could be in the middle. Sorry, I got derailed.
One of the things that was used to explain to me that Superman was pure fantasy was just action reaction, which is for him to throw himself through the sky, he had to exert force equivalent to that. So essentially, he's going to knock down the building he leaps off of, and that's where you have to go and find a fantastic element that takes the laws of action and reaction, throws it out the window.
Yeah, physics and superheroes don't quite work.
Physics, we don't do the stinking physics.
Like in my stories, I like the average Joe becoming something.
Yeah.
Like Dungeons and Dragons, you start over first level, and then all of a sudden you're growing into something bigger.
One of the other elements, we have encountered the Force and other elements of non-causality that are used in this. It seems to me that when we in the science fiction field want to use non-causality, guilty as charged, we refer to it as telekinesis, psychokinesis. Jack Sutton's wonderful book, The Beyond, on that, and there's dozens.
Psionics.
Where have you encountered, and start with you, Elizabeth, that, or how much do you think psionics is just another way of making magic sound acceptable in a science fiction setting?
So I spent 7 years studying the science behind parapsychology, and I have read a few books that involve some of the telekinesis, psychokinesis, the telepathy, precognition, and whatnot. And I think, for instance, like Firestarter is way over the top. And I think when you read a lot of those novels that are fantastical, it gives you kind of a bad idea of what it can actually, or in reality, people explain their experiences as. So precognition is perpetual. I think there's an urban fantasy, I'm trying to remember, Alex Versus, or Verus, I don't know if anybody's read that, urban fantasy. He's a precog, and he's a precog all the time. And he's accurate all the time. And there's no variable that interferes. He looks at all the variables and he chooses the one that's going to be correct for him. And that's not how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So when you ask the person who has precognitive abilities, they say, well, it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes I get some of the information right, but sometimes not. So that's the issue I have with, I guess, the paranormal stories that deal with what I've studied with parapsychology research. And that's my frustration, I think, is high expectations.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So we're kindred here.
Thank you.
I was like, wow, she gets room service. I'm impressed.
I know. Thank you.
I think part of it, and part of the reason why psionics and stuff really has come more to the forefront with the idea that our mind has latent abilities that we haven't tapped, is that's much easier to swallow than magic, because historically magic has always had evil aspects to it. It's demonic, it's from the other realm, it's things that no good person, we burn witches because of it. But if you can remove that mystical and that taint to go, well, it's not demons or gods giving me powers, it's this untapped power of our mind, which to a certain extent I've seen actually substantiated with some of the stuff that I've seen yogis do. Yeah, okay, I can't do that, my mind, or even just, watching people be able to pole walk, which, has been verified. That's in very ways a mystical power, but since there's no magic, it's easier to ascribe it to the power of our ability to overcome our bodies. And if you can do that, why can't you then affect outside?
I've seen some young people do things in martial arts tournaments. Here I am sitting as a judge on them, and it's like, I couldn't do that when I was 14 years old. I didn't think that was physically possible until about 2 seconds ago. Ari?
Oh, I definitely think it is a bit of window dressing. It's like you said, it's taking away the stigma, and if there's one thing humans love to do in their stories is reframe them. So when you start putting science in there, you don't want to put the old ways. You want to divorce yourself from them. So psionics is window dressing for magic.
Sure.
And I don't think there's a problem with that. But I also think as a creator or as someone studying the genre, you really have to step back and go, the Force is magic. They are space wizards. They have laser swords that have no physical way of stopping at X length. And how do they stop things?
The midichlorians, that.
Actually, I was going to say the midichlorians is when Star Wars went from pretty much just fantasy space opera into science fantasy, because they finally had to explain it. And when a little bit of explaining comes in, that's where science fantasy takes over for fantasy. Because in most high fantasy, no one bothers to explain where the magic came
I
from.
always thought the biggest element of the science fantasy of Star Wars was being able to go interstellar in a one-man fighter with no toilet. Garrett?
Well, in my books, I fixed going to the bathroom, so I don't have to worry about that.
There you go.
They literally don't go.
Nanobots interact with technology around them to
Clever but disgusting.
and then
Where did the nanobots go?
they just dissolve in the body. So you don't have to go at all unless you're going on a mission. You got to shoot some additional nanos in you to take care of bodily waste.
I am both impressed and horrified in equal measure, and I live for it.
And there's a reason for that, only because I calculated how much time I spent in the bathroom for the last 54 years, and I'm like, you know what? I could have done so much more.
But how much doom scrolling could you have accomplished without it?
Including had you not done that calculation.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking of a couple of examples of writers who I think of and works that I think of. For example, the Dragon Rider's Current is a science fantasy. And in fact, I think it started as a fantasy, and she then decided to take it in the direction of science fiction by having it be a lost colony ship that somehow or other got moved
Not
back in
if you talk
time.
to her.
Yeah.
She always said it was science fiction. She has actually flat out said she always said it was science fiction.
Even though it's mostly about dragons.
It's mostly about dragons, and it's also about a society that has developed in this quasi-medieval mold over a considerable period of time that she didn't have, except that she went back in time to stick it there. Another one for me would be, and this is going back some of you may remember Lee Bracken was a great screenwriter in Hollywood, and lesser known as a science fiction writer, but an excellent science fiction writer, who wrote Eric John Stark and the Ginger Star series. Eric John Stark is kind of a combination of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. He was raised by Aboriginals, originally on Venus, before we discovered that Venus is, in fact, the 9th level of hell. So she moved to
No,
Interstellar.
it's actually the 7th level because it's hot.
Okay.
9th is cold.
Sort of like Dallas, Texas.
There you go.
Yeah, don't argue with the vampire and demon riders on which level.
It never would occur to me to do so. But, so she sent it Interstellar, and then she was able to have him raised by Aborigines under a far star. And he goes looking for the man that was a stepfather, and he goes to a world which basically you don't have modern weapons. He's a swordsman on that. So she preserved all those elements while setting it in a science fiction world. What was the other one? Marion Zimmer Bradley's Dark Over.
There's Michael Christopher Stashev's series.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
say again?
Christopher Stashev's series, where it's both magic and space. You know, that they're using magic while they're in spaceships going to other planets. Yeah, there's been quite a few of them that have blended
Do you
it.
have another one in mind?
Oh, let's see, if you're talking magic and space,
Just any.
What do you think of Jack Chalker? Is any, his
As
private
well,
Jack
life,
Chalker
his,
actually
world,
is a good
And it's
candidate
kind of
with
like
his demons, yeah.
high science, but everybody's changing their physical attributes.
What about like Farscape? You know, they had the person that was part of the ship.
Mhm.
I think it
Yeah.
sensed their way through
Yeah.
traveling.
But it was like, I mean, Farscape is obviously very fantastical, but they always sort of said, well, there's wormholes and there's aliens. It's kind of like Doctor Who, it's always aliens, it's never ghosts.
Well, rather like with Aaron McCaffrey and the ship is sank,
Yeah.
he just becomes organically part of the ship. So I would say that would be mostly on the science fiction end of it.
Yeah, because that's plausible
Mhm.
that you could transfer consciousness into the technology.
Well, and his living biological body was in fact still there. So the nexus, the merge between technology and our bodies, Allah goes to the shell, is sort of taking part. You know, we've seen there's a gentleman walking around here on a artificial limb. It's not peg leg. I mean, it's obviously a complicated device. The more complicated ones, which allow somebody to actually control their fingers with the electrical impulses of their brain, that is now reality. That was science fiction or science fantasy.
Yeah,
40
the chip
years
Elon
ago.
Musk put in that gentleman who couldn't do anything now. We gotta move the mouse around on the screen and
Sure. You know, one of the things, of course, is our brains are, in fact, electrical computers. It is biologically run, and mine can never figure out what the hell keys are. But, there's a reason to think that you can communicate with something if you're electrical based, and it's electrical based. It's a little bit what you were saying about the quark particles resonating.
Well, I mean, let's take no, full disclosure, I've not seen The Way of Water, but the original Avatar. With the transplanting your consciousness into another being, and then that being able to communicate with the planet and stuff. You've got lots of, quote, magic, but at the same time, I could give you a pretty good argument that that's actually technologically feasible. Do I know how to do it? No. But can I tell you that we've already got the guidelines to build the technology to do it? Absolutely.
Beyond that, there are life forms on our planet. You telegraph trees. They're actually trees themselves that communicate over long distances.
Oh, yeah,
The
there's proof of
fungi.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fungus.
That's why there's so
they
many
can do
mushroom
molds,
things.
Or they can do mazes.
This character, not to give away too much, but there's not that many people in the world, at some point lives as a human woman for a period of about 53 years in a body it's constructed for, and then resumes life in her android body. And one of the questions that she asks herself is, am I the same tomorrow I was before, or am I merely a ghost? That would be a question. If you can go from body to body, are you the same person? Dr. McCoy used to wonder about that James Blish.
Let's not get into the transporter is murder argument this time of night because
James Blish did an entire book on it.
yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
well, there's an AI startup company that just started to continue your loved ones when they pass on. So pretty much you download every picture movie of them to the AI, and then you would fill out a profile, and my wife would fill out a profile for me, and then it would learn being me. So
That just sounds
That's
like
some
hell.
Black Mirror
you
shit
go
right
20,
there.
20 years in the future, they're watching Star Wars 50. It's learning, and it could be, hey, you remember that one we saw back in the 90s? It was so great, and she's having a conversation with me.
I don't think
and
there's any
learning.
question that we could simulate that, simulate a person continuing to exist almost to the point where it's indistinguishable. It's not the person, but
Well, will it
from
be?
the outside.
Will it be in 100 years? Will it become
Well,
sentient?
That's
You know,
one of my favorite sort of science fantasy fiction arguments, and again, going back to my own work, I have Mora as the only actual artificial sentient person to ever occur. I mean, she doesn't know how it occurred. It's because we can't make anything live. We can't make that chair live. We can't even restore life to something that had it and has lost it. So what it is that changes unlife to life, we haven't figured out. That is one of the areas where science hasn't yet at least provided us, Dr. Frankenstein, with the example.
Bicentennial Man. The one with Robin Williams, where he's an android. That if you watch it as a comedy, it's entertaining, but if you actually watch it as a sociological commentary on how we would deal with it,
Mhm.
it makes me never want to ever do that. I mean, I am still, to this day, I think one of the best horror movies of all time is Highlander.
Mhm.
Who the hell wants to live forever?
Right here.
No. I'm like going, I have buried so many people in my life. I can't imagine living hundreds of years where I literally bury every single person.
That would be a horrible thing, but that's why my book is Second Life of Mr. Hunt, because I'm living the dream through someone who accidentally got resurrected for in the future.
I think if you were the only person that was as the Highlander from the Cloud is, and that and this character also has that issue that when you don't have a defined life expectancy, you're going to suffer. If you have any empathy and any ability to attach to people, you're going to suffer because you're fighting a losing battle against death all the time. You know, people, and you know, I'm 66 years old. I've lost a lot of people, buried contemporaries and so forth. And, you know, that's an astonishing thing to live through. And to think that you might have to endure 2,000 years of it, I may be with you on that one. I might like to live to be 150 if I can be spry.
Yeah, it's the healthy part of it too.
Yeah, that is the
If I can live the rest of my life at the age of 28,
Yeah, not a problem.
Still do that in 20 years, it'll be worth being here. But if I'm in a diaper, no.
And Highlander is science fantasy too, once they started introducing aliens to it.
I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay, cover your ears. There's actually a movie
Does not
called
exist.
Highlander 2.
Not
No, it doesn't exist. We are erasing history.
I was forced to watch that for a podcast, and I am spreading that suffering. to all
Yeah,
of
I've
you.
actually watched all of them and
I'm sorry.
kind of regret it.
well, sentient AIs are talking like Blade Runner.
Yeah, Blade Runner. Now that's a good one.
That speech at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Has anybody here seen Altered Carbon
Yes.
on Netflix?
Mm.
Just buy it.
Watched a
Example.
couple episodes. Basically, they're short stories, right?
Give me what you think, we'll start at Garrett's end over here, are your best and worst science fantasy experiences, if you have them. Obviously, Highlander has left a mark.
Yeah, Highlander
Somewhere
2. We've covered.
Best is I enjoyed Babylon 5 series.
Yeah.
To me, that's the closest to what I think the future would be because it still has people
That
trying
to
to
me-
get ahead.
That to me is very far on the science fiction end of it, with the fantasy end being.
There's
To
some
me,
fan, to me,
there's
there's
They're
some fan.
techno mages.
Yeah,
Yeah.
techno mages, and yeah, I'm glad you raised that because I was going to
And Space
Babylon 5 Crusade.
Living ships. You got the telepaths.
Yeah, the techno mages, on the other hand, basically use technology to simulate magic, don't they? But they don't actually relate to magic.
To me, I also define science fantasy as where you are presenting the fantastical through a lens of science, and thus I think Babylon 5 is a great example.
Nothing
of it.
wrong with that as a definition either, because again, we're talking about a field where we're sort of, feeling our way along, and there isn't a hard.
Yeah.
And then there's the mythical with you said the angels.
Yeah, the
The
Warlocks.
Warlock, when he came out with the Invito suit, everyone called it a different name because they
Yeah.
explored their worlds when they were young. They
I
saw
mean-
them as gods.
Yeah, that is absolutely my peak of science fiction. But if I'm talking about science fantasy, I would have to probably go, just because I am a child of 1977, it would be the original Star Wars. It would be that moment
Yeah, the original.
where that moment Luke Skywalker is looking at the horizon and there are two suns. And
Yes.
that's a moment of fantasy. That is a moment of a hero being born. And they're space wizards and they're sound in space and it's absolutely ridiculous. But to me, it captured a magic and a zeitgeist. And thus, that to me is the pinnacle of science fantasy, personally. And then we have Highlander 2, which we will just say it and move on
The
down.
therapy session on that.
Yes,
tomorrow.
Yeah.
Kroll.
Or some of the later
Kroll.
Kroll.
Oh, I like Kroll.
Kroll
But I mean,
was,
think
wasn't
about
that
it.
originally a Robert Howard book, if I'm remembering correctly? Or am I?
There is a book called Kroll. It has nothing to do with the movie Kroll. Because he had a spaceship. It was in space, flying around. And then you had things, you had Kroll, you had Time Bandits, you had Ice Pirates.
It was a whole 80s
They were
just.
all just space
Yeah.
science
I can tell
fantasy.
you
and it
this
was
because
so
I was
much
there in the 80s.
fun.
We did a lot of stuff you all should not do.
It was called cocaine.
Yeah.
It
Well,
was
it's not getting so
entertaining.
specific.
I mean, for true space fantasy, I go back to that stuff, all the way back to including Last Starfighter, Enemy Mine, because they were like, oh look, what can we do? And there wasn't as many rules, it seems like, as what they were now. Because I don't think you would come up with Kroll nowadays, that would just never happen. Ice Pirates, Time Bandits. I still have the VHS of Time Bandits.
I mean, Kroll has a literal wizard and then people shooting lasers.
Lasers.
I'm thinking Call of the Conqueror
Yeah.
as Robert Howard.
Cool, yeah.
Howard.
This was, he had the weird, springy, it was a thing that went like this.
The round killing.
Are you talking about the glaive?
Yes, the glaive.
Yeah.
That was
I know
like
what
this,
you're talking about,
and
yeah.
he would throw it and it would go,
Yeah.
and then Xena copied it with just the round thing. But yeah, his glaive that he would throw and then it would collapse. That was awesome as a kid.
And it
I
had Captain
totally
America's
wanted one.
shield physics.
Yeah.
Cyclops.
We in the
was it
martial
Cyclops
arts
that could
world
see his own
was-
death?
Yes,
Yes.
Cyclops that could only see his own death.
And you've got Dark Crystal.
We in the martial arts world always find those weapons very entertaining. As often as you get clipped in practice working with a quarterstaff or, this finger was originally a different shape, there are a couple of cuts here, you're going to get hit with a weapon.
Okay,
The 80s
how
were also
many of us
Oh, God,
that were,
yes.
were high school in the 70s and 80s and had boys who had nunchucks? And how many of them got to watch them hit themselves in the balls with the nunchucks, trying to do the...
I've done it numerous times.
That is probably the
I had hit
weapon
myself
that is
in
the
the head.
most dangerous to the user of any. Bruce Lee made it look easy, and I've watched people
Yes,
beat themselves senseless.
for young women watching The Stupid Men, it is the most entertaining weapon there is in the world.
I think I will take this.
We've
thing.
explained it.
Yeah, why would you?
It's gonna look cool to be able to go on the side of the leg and come up again.
The only thing is, it might terrify some other man that you can do that, and you think, I don't want to mess with this. That's what he's willing to do. But, yeah, we have a saying in Kung Fu, which is the first shot you get down there, you think you're going to die. The second shot, you hope you're going to die. The first shot. The third shot, you realize you're not going to die, and you hit him, and he's very surprised. Because, it's like many things in life. It doesn't get better, but it becomes familiar. So you learn to deal with it. Not that I recommend the course of that. I don't know when I give you a chance to chime in on that question.
It took a lot of time, so I'm glad everybody, had their moment. I look at Stargate as probably some of the pinnacle of pure good sci-fi. I can't think of anything particularly magical because they were able to explain.
I mean, you did have the
technology.
Ascendants.
Yeah.
They even explained that some of the ancient stuff was because it was just so advanced. We didn't have the knowledge base for it. But Planet 9 from outer space has got to be absolutely.
Women from Venus?
Oh yeah, I mean.
Was that the one with Zsa Zsa Gabor?
No, that was which one?
Queen of Outer Space.
Queen
Sorry.
of- yeah.
Yeah.
What was it, Barbarella?
Barbarella,
Oh,
Jane
yeah.
Fonda.
Oh my gosh, you're right.
With Duran Duran
in
in
the
it.
cemetery.
A movie that Jane Fonda herself
Yeah.
said, I can't watch this unless someone that really loves me is holding my hand.
The movie was so bad.
The orgasm. Is that the one with the orgasmerator?
Yeah.
The Orgasmatron.
Oh,
Yeah.
Orgasmatron. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry. I messed that up.
Vampire.
And the guy who was in not Star Crash, Space Mutiny was the angel. And then he was the bad guy in Space. Space Mutiny is also a horrible science fantasy because they do have, they have the Valerian witches and a colony ship. And, they give a dead girl her job back due to bad editing.
I believe in corporate America they would think about doing that.
If you get a chance, I suggest the MST3K version of Space Mutiny. Blast hard cheese all the way. But it is a way to enjoy good, bad space fantasy.
What piece would you like to see, a piece of literature, a science fantasy piece of literature, translated to the big screen?
My own.
Right?
We'll take that as a given across
Yes.
the board.
Besides your own.
Besides your own.
Mm.
There actually is a sci-fi series. It has a little bit of fantasy in it every once in a while. Backyard Starship series.
Mhm. I
Oh,
don't know
yeah,
that one.
Maggart and Cheney stuff,
Yeah.
yeah. Terry would love that. Yeah,
I love that.
Is that in the same vein as Salvage One with Andy Griffith from the 1970s? Where I think this plumber tooled together a starship and he had to color drive.
It's more like his grandfather dies and he goes into his barn and there's a spaceship. And finds out his grandfather was a space ranger.
Yeah.
Oh,
And now he takes the footsteps and it's like
what is this called?
Backyard Starship. Like
You have
25
you
books in
have
the
me
series.
interested in this.
Yeah, it's by Jay and Cheney and Terry Maggart.
It's really entertaining.
And all right.
I'd like to see John Carter redone with like an actual more accurate, proper thing. Either that or let's be real, let's just have him remake Krull with modern special effects. It might lose all its charm, but I kind of want to see them redone. We've had too many good movies redone. Let's have some of the ones that could benefit from modern special effects budgets.
That was, I think, the longest movie in production, the John Carter.
It was
Yes.
It
It's
was
been a
like
lot of
90
money.
years in production or some crazy thing like that.
And they just kept the rights hung up in
that
limbo.
was what it was. They kept the rights, they optioned it, and so forth. So
I want to say it was in production for like 13 years.
And they just kept recasting people.
As the other actors died of old age. Mel, was there a particular piece?
I'm thinking, so I read too much novel, stunning idea that I read too much. Do you guys remember the Deathstalker series by Simon Green?
Yeah, I
I've
remember.
heard of
Is
it.
that the Deathstalker really horrible movie based off that?
No,
too?
no,
Oh, okay.
It's a space opera series, but basically the main character is all but immortal simply because nanobots and everything else. It is
Taking his
very
crew
much
off the
set.
ship.
Well, but everything's sword fights. There's spaceships and everything else, and it's sword fights. But I mean, each book's like 250,000 words. There's a series of
It does seem that
books
in the
each one
future,
really-
all combat will be conducted at point blank range. Now we fire missiles over the horizon and so forth. I suppose the only reason that could come about that you start getting, to very short ranges with weapons again is that the electronics get so good that everything is spoofed and it's beyond visual range. You're just not going to hit anything.
AKA the Dune effect.
And in fact,
Yeah.
they had even more so that their force fields would actually slow a fast-moving weapon a great deal, whereas a slow-moving weapon would penetrate.
Well, one of my friends pointed this out, he actually has an anthology going for it, is that in the future, the odds are that we're all in space, be it space stations, spaceships, space colonies, whatever. The last thing you would ever want anybody to have would be a weapon that could pierce the hull.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
everything would go
Right?
back to being
Oh my gosh.
swords, knives, poison.
Right.
You would go back to an
Thank you
almost
for bringing that one.
Renaissance level of I hate you, so I'm gonna stick a sword in your side. I'm not gonna shoot you with a gun because that's a capital crime because you then put everybody else at the ship. Can you imagine just a regular armor-piercing bullet in a ship ricocheting and hitting things?
Yeah.
Sonic
Isn't that what
weapons.
happens?
Yeah, well,
Plus-
not even Sonic.
Well-
If you disrupt the electricity or something that's running the ship. So I could talk to you about some really cool. They found
that's-
fungus that eats radiation.
Let's
Yes.
also talk about the fact that gravity works very differently.
Mm-hmm.
And, the velocity issue and the gravity issue, you
Well,
have
the
no
fact that the air
idea
pressure
what you're
isn't the
aiming
same.
for, and pressure.
Mhm.
Well, still, you don't have any idea that what you're aiming for might be
Yeah.
what
The
you're gonna
centrifugal
get
force
anyway.
in the ship could
Right.
really
And
take
so
your
then
vector and throw it off.
if you don't give a crap about everybody else in the ship, you're not really sure you're going to have much accuracy.
So you're never going to use
Right. No, you're not gonna use
blasters,
projectiles,
guns,
no.
anything. It's
No.
going to go back to if I wanted to hurt or kill you, I'm not shooting you. It's poison. It's a knife. It's a garrote.
Or an
it's
electrical weapon
Or-
that would disrupt their neural
very
system.
short. Yeah, taser. Boom, back of the neck.
exactly.
We gonna
Rub-
tase
rubber
you, bro, in
bullets and so
space?
forth.
Yes,
Yeah.
back of the neck.
Right.
You wouldn't want to do the shots.
Yeah,
It would be
open
up close
pinch
personal.
or something.
Yeah, the problem, of course, with firing, if you take an M16, press the trigger, 1.5 seconds later, 16, 2, 3 rounds of, full metal jacket are tearing through electronics, they're tearing through the water system, they're bending in space,
The person's the last thing you
Or
care
they're
about.
bouncing around and hitting you.
Yeah.
I would hope in the future the hulls would be able to take a small arms firearm or a rifle round and not do anything.
Probably on a warship,
Well, I would think the whole, but not the interiors.
Oh, you care less about the interior, going through a little bulkhead going into another room of
Yeah.
combat.
I think it depends on the power of the individual weapon. Like if you were standing in the USS Nimitz and you fired that same weapon, you'd probably kill everybody in the compartment because it's bouncing over, but it's not getting into the next one and it's not opening up the vessel to ocean. On the other hand, as I said, right now, all the spaceships that we know of or that are foreseeable for us, because you don't have to build them so strong as to hold out an ocean, all of them would be wrecked by that same burst of fire.
Like I had thought about that because I had a small space battle in my last book.
Mm-hmm.
And someone had mentioned, it looks like in space battles, it looks like little pirate ships going across each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I made wormhole missiles.
Yeah.
So you can detect things coming in, they go disappear into the wormholes. And then all of a sudden, as the wormholes open, ships come out, but then there's also debris coming out.
Sure. Well, and like I said, the distances will either be tremendous, along with the speeds, or they will be very close because no weapon that you can fire can lock onto anything.
Or I fire a magic missile at you.
There you go.
I fired at the
darkness.
Flamethrowers, because they wouldn't mess with the hull.
Leaf blower. Okay. Well, that has potential.
Fire, I cannot speak. Flamethrowers.
Flamethrowers.
When in doubt, flamethrowers.
Well, when in doubt, fireball.
Yeah, one of them.
What was your favorite application of a fantasy element in your own stuff? I'm not sure how applicable this is in your writing, but what was your favorite application of a definite fantasy element in what you were doing? Telepathy, psychokinesis, sheer magic.
Well, I always like to go with the consequence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're using something, no matter what is there's going to be a cause and reaction.
Cause and effect.
Yeah. So those are interesting because everybody reads a story to figure out what the consequences are of somebody doing something, right? And how they're going to overcome that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's any narrative.
This is my precaution to make sure that you all get time to tell everybody that you're working for the
Gotcha.
purchase, but we'll sort of finish that favorite call. Fantastic element.
One of my series is called the Twisted Luck series, and when I first started designing it, I had a pet peeve against magic. I write lots of fantasy. My pet peeve against magic is that people never use it to its fullest things. Like, they'd be like, oh, you can only move a cup of water. You're so weak, you can't do anything. And I'm like, all I need to do is move like half a tablespoon and I can blind you. I can kill you. I suck it out of your brain. It's easy. So I set up all of my magic that you had to actually understand physics and biology to do it. At one point, I literally had calculated, because you have to offer up genetic materials to be able to do magic. So mostly it's hair or nails or stuff. I had calculated how many molecules you had to offer up to do stuff. I had this huge chart with molecules to the square, what it would take. And finally I went, you know what, nobody's ever going to ask me this. But it was fun making it so that you can't just go, I throw a fireball. You have to understand, I need to have something where the molecules are moving faster to the point that they ignite, that I then...
Avogadro's number, basically, of
Yes,
molecules.
lots of joule weights and everything
That's
else.
cool. I like
And
that idea.
I kind of backed it off, but one of the fun things is that you were always having to make genetic offerings. So I have an entire society where you almost never cut your hair. You use your nails, you use the dermis on your skin, and there was one conversation, I've had it a couple times, and we're all adults here, talking about using uterine linings, using semen, using your eggs, because those are all things you can actually select and offer up, that especially men can offer up semen almost constantly. Women have a finite number of eggs, but I talked about at one point, it was just that little tiny mention that magic really liked it when you offered up stuff that involved life. So if you offered up blood or eggs, uterine lining, semen, you were able to do more for less because that was such a much more powerful offering.
All right.
That is cool. I like that. It's very
I killed a vampire with Parmesan cheese. That was my.
That does sound like a personal best.
What I said, so yes, award-winning series, what can I say? But remember I said vampires, they have a cellulose allergy. That's how steaks actually kill them. Well, there was a whole thing about the amount of cellulose contamination in great value Parmesan cheese. And as soon as I saw that article, I actually had a group of werewolves. By the way, werewolves are a virus, just so you know. Engineer a Parmesan cheese bomb at an Italian restaurant to take out the vampires.
Oh my
Cheap
God.
Parmesan cheese.
It was cheap Parmesan cheese. It was horrified. They had gotten a shipment of the cheap Parmesan cheese, and that had been a big, emotional beat of them complaining about it, and then it ended up saving them. Because once you introduce Chekhov's can of Parmesan cheese, you must use it to blow up the vampires in Act 3.
Absolutely. Gary, why don't you finish that thought and then start with where we can find you?
Sure. My main character is learning that something's different, and he gets attacked by something called a Xeno Shadow, and he grabs him by the ankle, and all of a sudden the Xeno Shadow's hand explodes in blue fire and starts running off. And he looks down at his foot, and his foot's glowing blue. And he thinks someone else did, and now he's starting to learn that somehow he can conjure this blue fire when there's demons around. So, it gets better after that.
So where can we find your work?
Actually, I will be by the main room. I think it's the lake house or lake room.
Lakeshore?
Lakeshore room. I'll be right out there tomorrow, selling all 4 of my books that are currently in the series. And I can also be found on Amazon.
And yourself.
If you want to see Quantum Entanglement worked into a book with burritos and demons, The Accidental Summoner is available at the Falstaff Mothership right now. Otherwise, I have cards here where you can find my work at www.rachelecar.com, or you can find me online at Total Recar on all the socials. Yes, if you get my handle, you will get the jokes.
I'm Mel Todd. You can find me at Badash Publishing. You can pretty much find all of my stuff everywhere, but buy it from me because I make more money. Or you can go get my books. I'm literally sitting in front of the bathroom. So if nature calls you, my table is in front of the bathroom.
so smart.
No, I had no choice in that. Honestly, I would have
Still.
preferred inside because I'm standing on tile and carpet is so much more comfortable.
Elizabeth?
So mine is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble as ebook and print on demand and many other platforms.
I'll be out here tomorrow. My stuff is through 2 publishers, Copper Dog and Ad Asker. Ad Asker's just me. When you work with a lot of small presses, they fold up. Sometimes you put your books back out on your own. Everything I do can be found on Amazon, and luckily I've got some wonderful voice actors in New York, the Broadway actors that are doing audiobooks for me through Actors Everywhere. And if anybody's looking for audiobooks, they are a great outfit to work with. Thank you very much for your time and attention and participating, and I hope that you all enjoyed this.
Thank you for being
Thank you for being here on a Saturday night
At 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock.
So I'm close to the thing, the best way to keep it